So, as we look at World War One, we talked about the factors and the causes leading up to the war, and really the beginning of the war, the countries that jumped in. Remember, initially the United States held back in the idea of isolationism. They were separate from this war, but eventually we would join in. And so the U.S. enters World War One on April 6, 1917. And so the United States, was an ally of Great Britain and France, and they declared war on Germany. And because remember, as we talked in class a little bit, Germany and their U-boats had sunk several merchant ships, and including the Lusitania, that was a passenger ship that was sunk by Germany. Eventually, the United States entered the war. And so, in order to gather enough troops, they did something that was called the draft. And so, essentially, it is like throwing everybody's name in a hat. Any healthy American man, 18 to 25, their name was thrown into basically a list of potential people that could be drafted for the war. And as they were picked, eventually 4 million men were drafted. Now, many also volunteered, but that's thousands of people sent to Europe every single day throughout the remainder of the war. The U.S. Navy sent supplies and battleships and the Marines to help fight against the Central Powers in Europe. We were against the Central Powers. We were with the Allied powers, so we sent not just troops, but money and supplies throughout the remainder of the war. And so eventually, the United States joining in kind of pushed the tide of Germany being defeated and the Central Powers being defeated, because for a while they were definitely in the lead of winning this war. But it's November 11, 1918, that the surrender occurred. And so today, that date, November 11, is celebrated as Veterans Day. It's not just to remember all those that fought in World War One, but really all the wars that Americans have fought over the years. It's a way to remember our veterans. But when we talk about Germany surrendering, really there are some huge consequences to them losing this war. And remember, there were other countries involved, but most of the blame shifted to Germany here. And so that was the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles in France, that's where the treaty was signed. And so this is, remember, a treaty is basically the terms that the winners put in as the conditions of surrender. And so in order for Germany, for us to accept their surrender, they had to agree to these terms. So January 1919, President Woodrow Wilson and all of the other Allied leaders met and wrote up this treaty. President Wilson, his hope was that it would make sure that peace continued into the future and that there would never be another war. And unfortunately, he was kind of outvoted because a lot of the other European leaders pushed for even harsher consequences than what the United States was willing to force. But in the end, we were among the group that decided to enact these consequences. And so the first thing the treaty said is that Germany must give up some of the land that they had. And remember, they tried to take over as much land as they could in Europe at this time. Just really, if you look at the map, Denmark, Poland, France gained some of the land of Germany, obviously weakening the country, and that was the first consequence. Secondly, the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany must pay $33 billion in reparations, repair. When you talk about repairing, a lot of it is repairing all the losses that France and other European countries faced because of the destruction of this war. But it's basically Germany paying back as a consequence. All these other countries said, you owe us money, and as a payment for all the damage you did in this war. So here's the deal. $33 billion was an absurd amount of money to charge them. And so really this, you're talking about, if you talk about in terms of money today, this is closer to what, in the ballpark of $300 billion in now in terms of money. And so back then, it's a lot now, but back then it was an absurd amount that Germany was asked to pay. And so the world felt they needed consequences, but really this crippled their economy. And so you talk about them having to pay back this money. And so on and off throughout the years, they would have to pay this. And it took them 92 years to finally pay back fully, based on different plans, pay back fully the full amount. And so it wasn't until 2010 that Germany was free of this debt as far as these reparations. And so it made the German economy, the money, basically worth nothing. Inflation, where the money basically hyperinflation is what it was. It was these German marks were basically useless. It got to the point where 42 billion German marks were equivalent to what 1 American cent was worth. You couldn't even use the money anymore. So eventually there had to be a plan of what would happen with Germany's economy. But it made German citizens extremely upset and wanting revenge. And so you talk about other consequences. Germany had to disarm their military, not make any more weapons. They were only allowed a certain number of soldiers. They still were allowed some, but very minimal. And so it completely wiped out their military, so that they couldn't ever start a war like this again or be part of a war. Also, the treaty said that Germany must accept the government that was put in place. And so leaders were chosen to run their country. And of course, the German people hated the fact that they did not vote for these leaders. They didn't support these leaders. They weren't even Germans that they wanted as leaders. And at this point, once again, this built up this hatred for the rest of the world that was putting these consequences on them. Also, the treaty said that Germany must accept full blame for the war. And so there were a lot of factors, like I've said in other days, but in the end, Germany was forced to take full blame that they were the start of this war and that they were the reason that all of the deaths and the damage and destruction throughout Europe, they were pointed at as the sole factor, and they had to take on the guilt of that. So Germany, after World War I, completely devastated their finances, their economy. People were not happy with these terms. They couldn't find jobs, their unemployment. Basically, the German people were desperate. They would do anything to even just survive because they had no money, they had no food. And so you have these Germans that couldn't find jobs. They joined something called the Communist or the Socialist Party. And the National Socialist Party's leader, Adolf Hitler, was gaining more and more power. This is a guy that said, listen, I'm going to build back Germany to become a powerful nation again. You have no food, you have no money, you have no jobs. Well, I will make Germany strong and powerful. And so many Germans that were just trying to survive and really wanted revenge against the rest of the world joined in and began to follow this leader. Little did they know that eventually, as all of the world would discover, that this man was completely insane and would do so much destruction and devastation to the lives of so many people. And that's what led to World War II. And so a lot of people point back to the Treaty of Versailles and all the different conditions that ultimately led to World War II happening. And so as we study this, there's a couple videos and there's some links in our different pages to explore this more.